Hello, and welcome to Biology 101. My name is Dr. Randy Papke, and I'll be your guide and teacher for the rest of the semester. In this class, we use Campbell Biology in Focus, the third edition, and you can access this online, and there is a link on Blackboard to help you out. We are studying science this semester. In particular, we're studying a subset of science called biology, right? In general, science is a way of understanding. It's a process, it's a set of information, but I like to think about it as an approach to understanding the world. If that's what science is, and biology is a subset of science, then we are using science to understand the living world. That's what biology is. In particular, science tends to use the process of inquiry, and inquiry is just the search for information. It's trying to explain this world, this universe, and come up with good reasons for what's going on, a good cause. Look, science is not easy. I'm the first one to admit that science is not easy. There's lots of challenges associated with it, and there's going to be lots of challenges in you learning this as well. But one of the things I love about biology is it really is an adventure. I've enjoyed all of the things that I've learned in biology. I've enjoyed doing science. It's very fun for me. But it's also, a huge amount of luck to be able to figure something out, something new, something interesting and challenging. And in order to put everything together, you also have to be able to plan very carefully. One of the things I admire most about scientists is how well they plan and they reason. This might make you think that science is kind of very boring. Science, if you're going to do science well, you have to be very creative. You have to think outside the box. You have to be able to imagine things with just inside your brain that you could never see with your eyes. That's creativity. And of course, it takes a lot of persistence. Sometimes science is a little slow, but we keep making progress. That's the thing about science. You keep making progress. It's a slow process. Sometimes it's just looking at things around you, making observations. Sometimes it involves making formal logical hypotheses. Sometimes it involves testing them in very formal ways. Sometimes those ways are informal. One of the things that I've noticed about my learning in science is that biology tends to begin with very careful observations. I actually love this picture that I chose for this slide because these are citizen scientists. These are people who are not actually scientists by degree, by having earned a PhD or something. They're just people who love nature and want to help scientists do their experiments. And here we see a couple of people who are citizen scientists making careful observations. Biologists, people who want to be biologists, or just students are going to describe natural structures and processes and really try to understand the natural world. It's also really important, and I can't emphasize this enough, that anybody who's interested in going into science is really going to have to read about science. They're going to have to understand what's happened in the past, things that other scientists have done before them, and then build on that foundation of existing knowledge. That's really critical. If you're not reading the information that came before you, if you're not learning like in a class like this, then you might not be understanding everything that you need to. So reading's really important. Once you get into science, you're going to do a lot of work with data, and data is just the fact that you've recorded information, you've recorded observations, and those observations can really be just about anything that you're making careful observations about and recording them. But we do have a couple of categories that we use to describe these data. The first one is qualitative data. Qualitative data is data that's using like words or descriptions instead of measurements. Jane Goodall, who you see here with one of or two of the chimpanzees that she studied, was a very careful observer. She used words to describe behavior, and we now understand chimpanzee behavior because of the work that she did throughout her entire lifetime. Another version of data is called quantitative data. And yes, Jane Goodall did take quantitative data. She did record measurements. She did organize information in graphs as well. But we tend to think of quantitative data as being the most important part of science. And that's not necessarily true. We have to understand all aspects of science, and that includes being able to describe things in words as well as numbers. When you are gathering data, you might end up going through this process of drawing conclusions from this information. And if you are using inductive reasoning, you're going to draw conclusions through logical process, and we call that inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning starts with really big ideas. Maybe you'll throw or develop some hypotheses, and then look at a whole bunch of things to see if those hypotheses and those theories are confirmed. This is very common in science, and one of the examples that we'll be seeing this semester is the theory called cell theory. The concept all organisms are made of cells was based on centuries of looking through microscopes at living things and saying, yep, there's another living thing and it's also made of cells. So we started with this big idea, oh, maybe all things are made of cells, and observation after observation after observation has confirmed that for us. That's inductive reasoning. One of the most important concepts in science is the concept of the hypothesis. And the hypothesis is defined as an explanation. I know you have probably learned the definition that a hypothesis is an educated guess, and this is not a good definition. Educated guess doesn't really incorporate the idea that a hypothesis really is an explanation. You're really trying to explain why things are happening, and you're basing these on observations. You also want to know that hypotheses have to be tested. They have to be testable. So if you come up with this wild idea and there's no way to test it, then it's not quite science. So there has to be an explanation. There has to be something that you can test to make sure that it is true or false. And so the good thing about hypotheses is that they lead to very specific predictions, and we test those predictions to see whether or not our hypotheses are supported. The way we test the hypotheses are often doing something called an experiment. Experiment is a scientific test, and the scientific test is, well, there's lots of different ways to do it, but the best way, the most careful way, is to carry something out under controlled conditions. Now, Jane Goodall couldn't always carry out her observations under controlled conditions, and so she didn't necessarily do the things that we think of as experiments, but she definitely did science. So you can do science without doing experiments. We usually conflate those two ideas. We usually put them together and say, oh, science is experiments. And well, that is a really good way to do science, so there's probably a good reason for that. Once you've come up with a hypothesis, or two or three, you might then go ahead and test them. So you can look at this idea of making this observation. Your desk lamp isn't working. Maybe you ask the question, why isn't your desk lamp working? And you have a couple of reasons for that. Remember, hypotheses are explanations. So the first hypothesis is, oh, the bulb's not working. The bulb is burnt out. And the second hypothesis might be the lamp is broken. The lamp itself is broken in some way. Now, both of those are testable. And so that makes both of those good scientific hypotheses. If you're using deductive reasoning, now remember we already talked about inductive reasoning, but if we're going to use deductive reasoning, we're going to extrapolate from general premises to more specific predictions. And we use deductive reasoning when we're testing these hypotheses experimentally. One thing that's critical to understand about hypotheses is that in science, we don't say that they've been proven. In science, we never say a hypothesis is proven. We say that because there are so many alternative explanations that could also be true. Maybe we just haven't thought about it. For example, if you go back to that light bulb experiment that we were thinking about, and we have two hypotheses, and maybe one of them's right, maybe one of them's wrong. it could be that there's a third hypothesis. The third thing, well, maybe the electricity is out in the house. Well, it could be the electricity is out in the house and the light bulb broke. There's always alternatives. And so if you've got good evidence for one thing, one of those hypotheses, we tend to say that the hypothesis was supported. We don't say the hypothesis was proven. Proven doesn't leave any room for additional things that could also explain what happened. If you're testing a hypothesis in lots of different ways, you actually increase your confidence in that hypothesis, our confidence in how valid that hypothesis is, and that makes us feel better about science. I've already mentioned to you that hypotheses have to be testable, but they also have to be falsifiable. And what that means is that you have to also be able to show that the hypothesis is not true. There are some things in this world that cannot be tested because people won't ever believe that they're not true. For example, something supernatural, that's beyond the scope of science. Literally supernatural means above nature. And in science, we study nature. So we don't really address things that are supernatural in science. We don't concern ourselves with those. We just concern ourselves with the natural world. You have probably heard about the process of science, and that's a very good thing that we learn about the process of science. But the truth is that very few scientific processes actually follow that flow chart that you might have learned about in high school. We could just do science like Jane Goodall, where we make observations in nature, ask questions, read the scientific literature, and maybe that's the end of your process of exploring and discovering science. There are many, many, many good scientists who spend their lives in observation and asking questions and not really trying to find out the answers to those. You could also get information from the community. Maybe you need to get some feedback from your peers, or maybe the study that you've done needs to be replicated. You have to publish, and you have to build a consensus in the scientific community and in the world that this concept is right. It's not just testing ideas and formulating hypotheses, predicting results, doing experiments, making observations, gathering data, analyzing. Those are important. Don't ever get me wrong. But it doesn't stop there when you analyze them. Maybe you need to use that to support another hypothesis or contradict a hypothesis, or maybe even come up with a new hypothesis altogether. Always, 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 science influences society, and society influences science. They're interconnected. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important for non-scientists to understand the process of science. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at actual scientific inquiry and see what that process of science looked like. This is a case study looking at coat color in mouse populations in Florida. One of the things that we could observe is that coat color patterns in animals vary widely in nature, even among members of the same species. What we're looking at here are the same species of mouse that live in two different habitats and have different coat colors. So a scientist might say, well, why do we see the pale mouse living in those pale sandy shores and the brown mouse living in the brown environment or the darker color environment? So what we do know by maybe reading some literature or by, making our own observations is that a lot of predators are visual hunters, especially predators of mice. You've got all kinds of birds that prey on mice, foxes and snakes. They're all visual predators. That means they use their eyes for hunting. A while ago, somebody named Francis Sumner made the hypothesis that color patterns in mice evolved as adaptations to camouflage the mice to protect them from predation. And Hopi Hextra and a group of her students tested the prediction that Sumner came up with earlier. So she read his prediction, his hypothesis, and she went about testing it. So here's what she predicted. Mice with coloration that does not match the habitat that they live in should be preyed upon, or we say can suffer heavier predation than the native well-matched mice. So what they did was they built these models of mice that resembled the mice that lived either on the beach or on the inland, and they put equal numbers of models in just kind of around in the habitats fairly randomly, but in both. So they put some of these pale mice in the darker habitats, and they put some of the darker mice in the pale habitats, and looked to see what would happen to these models. Again, they're not real mice they were studying. So what they showed was that the camouflaged models had way lower rates of predation, meaning like they had been moved or attacked or just kind of like, torn apart compared to the mismatched ones. And we can look at those data that they gathered. In the beach habitat, where they put out these models, the camouflage model had some predation, but not as much as the darker models. And in the inland habitat, it was the other way around. One of the things that you might have noticed looking when I showed you the data on the previous slide is that I talked about the word control. And when I talked about that word control, I was talking about how the pale mice in the beach environment, those were the control. Same thing for the dark mice in the dark environment. So a controlled experiment compares an experimental group, in this case, the non-camouflaged mice, compare those data to a control group, in this case, the camouflaged mice. The factor that's manipulated, in this case, the color, is the experimental variable. Anything that's manipulated is going to be called the experimental variable. The factor manipulated was color, and so that's specifically called the independent variable. The thing that we're measuring, the effect of the manipulated factor, like in this case the amount of predation, that's called the dependent variable. Whenever you're doing research, you try to get rid of unwanted variables. You don't eliminate them, but you kind of cancel them out using these control groups. And that's what the group did. We're moving on now to think about theories. And your book defines theory specifically in context of science. And I'm also going to argue that this way that we define theory in your book, is also specifically about biology. So this is what a theory is. It's much broader in scope than a hypothesis. Remember, the hypothesis was very specific. Oh, what's causing this coat color variation in mice, right? That's a specific question. And we could say, oh, predation, that's a very specific explanation. Theories are much broader. In casual conversation, we wouldn't use the theory for something, we often use it for something very, very specific, but that's not the way we use it in science. Theories, in some ways, are similar to hypotheses because you can test them. But the way we test them is to come up with hypotheses, so that way they really are quite different. The way we think about theories in biology, because we've been studying biology for so very long, is that we have so much evidence in biology that we say theories are supported by large bodies of evidence. Hypotheses, maybe you're testing them a couple of times. Maybe you're testing them a dozen times. Theories tend to have been tested many, many, many times in order to show that they have a lot of support. So we say theories are supported by a large body of evidence. Just as a reminder that science is a social process. human beings are scientists, and anyone who becomes a scientist is going to benefit from all of the discoveries from people who have come before them. Most scientists do not work independently. I could not have done my research by myself. I had advisors, I had students, I had undergraduates working with me. I had, other, friends helping me out. I had citizens helping me out. Science is a social process, and it's fun that it's social. This is one of the reasons why in class, in labs especially, we work in teams, we work with partners, because science is a social process. Scientists working from the same field of research will check each other. They'll say, scientist A, they think that this happened with their research. I wonder if I did that, if that would happen too. And so they check each other. They make sure they're being honest. So that's another aspect of how science is social. It's not some lone person in their lab with their lab coat on coming up with eureka discoveries. Science is also relates to society, and the relationship between science and society is very clear when we think about technology. You are using technology right now when you're listening to my voice. The goal of technology is really much more specific. It's an application. So maybe you're listening to this video over Wi-Fi. I know I'm recording it and uploading it over Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was discovered back in the 1940s by Hedy Lamarr, the actress. But we are using now this technology. She was thinking about just as this really cool idea of how waves form. We're using this technology now, and we're grateful for it. Science and technology rely upon each other in order to move forward, and that's another important thing to keep in mind. I hope you've enjoyed this first chapter of biology in your textbook. I'm not covering everything from the textbook. Your textbook does go into a lot of looking forward to what the semester might look like, and if you're interested in that, great. Go ahead and read through the rest of the chapter. Otherwise, I've told you all the information that I think is important, and we'll discover the rest of it as we move on.